Good evening, everybody. You're very welcome to tonight's webinar on the overview of the medicines shortage framework and new developments on the horizon for the management of medicines shortages. So we're just going to kick off with some housekeeping. So the domestics. So the webinar is being recorded. You can see the message on your screen. Everybody's microphones have been muted. Your videos can be on or off as you wish. We do recommend that if you're experiencing any problems with connectivity, that it's a good idea to turn off the video, your video. If you have any difficulty with sound, you can start by ensuring that the sound or speaker is not muted or turned down on your computer or phone, and you can try logging off and logging back on again. We're going to use the chat function this evening for questions or comments, and there will be a question and answer session at the end of Ellen's presentation. We may use some anonymized information from the webinar, and very shortly, Grace will put a link to the post-webinar survey. Actually, she's just done it there, and we really do appreciate it if you can complete the survey because it allows us to provide you with webinars that meet your needs. And what, of course, I should have said at the beginning is that my name is Fiona Leonard. I'm sorry, I should have started by introducing myself, and I'm one of the peer support pharmacists. So now I am going to introduce you to tonight's presenter and speaker, Ellen McGrath, MPSI. So Ellen is the Medicines Shortages and Borderline Classification Manager with the HPRA, or the Health Products Regulatory Authority. So I'll hand over to you now, Ellen. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, for that introduction. And I'm just going to take a second to share my screen, which is a PowerPoint presentation. Let's put that into presentation mode. In a second and take it back to the start. And just to welcome you all here to tonight's webinar and to thank you for taking the time out of your evenings, which I'm sure might be better spent maybe catching up with traders or something, that you've taken the time to come to this webinar. I'm hoping that it may address some gaps or provide some new information that's related to the area of management of shortages. I would like to thank all participants for attending, but also if you've submitted a question in advance, which have been kindly shared and facilitated by the IIOP. I'm hoping that the contents of the presentation address the vast majority of those submitted questions, and as Fiona has outlined, there's an opportunity to further deal with any questions that come up within, I suppose, the entirety of the presentation. I think there's one or two that don't get answered within the content, and I'm going to prospectively answer those, I suppose, at the very end of the presentation before we consider anything new that's presented as part of the evening tonight. So without further ado, there's quite a number of slides, but I'm going to mostly go through those as quickly as possible. We'll introduce who we are within the HPRA. So we have this quite a wordy title of Medicine Shortages and Borderline Classification. In terms of shortages itself, I'm the kind of operational lead. We just had a new member of staff join us in Grace O'Connor, and she's an assessor. And she'll be very much focused on some of the deliverables that are presented in today's slides in terms of kind of bringing forward new developments that we can facilitate as coordinators of the medicine shortage framework. And we have 3 scientific officers. Safa has been put on the other side of the board, but Safa is our 3rd scientific officer, and those scientific officers mostly bring they're tasked with really the management of receiving notifications, assessing notifications, and ensuring that shortages are published on our website, which we do on a relatively automated basis. Every 24 hours, new information that comes to us is within a 24-hour window. New information that comes to us from marketing authorizations is published on our website. In terms of our strategic engagements as a group within the HPRA, we have a number of strategic engagements, both, I suppose, nationally and within the European fora. And some of those are related to the cosmetics function, but just taking that into account, who we might be engaged with, besides the stakeholders within the medicine shortage framework is, in itself, include the likes of the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, the Department of Defence on critical entities resilience, the European Medicines Agency, the European Commission, the IPU, and then I suppose representative bodies such as EFA and MFI. In terms of strategic developments, we will be, I suppose, critical in terms of the national contribution that's underpinning the publication of the European Medicines Agency Union Critical List of Medicines. We would have also participated in the Critical Medicines Alliance, which was, I suppose, a group that was brought together in advance of the publication of the Critical Medicines Act. And we would also be involved in market surveillance activities that are related again to the more cosmetics, so not necessarily directly related to shortages. Going back to shortages specifically themselves, what is a medicine shortage? A shortage is defined as occurring when the supply of a medicinal product is inadequate to meet the needs of the patients. And the World Health Organization recognizes medicine shortages as a global problem, and they represent an increased focus for governments given their potential public health impact. This is not national, this is not European, this is global. And we see common issues with shortages that are represented by the likes of the TGA in Australia, the likes of the FDA in the US, and across all European member states in terms of key issues with availability that are not just limited to the Irish market. And a good example of that would be something like semaglutide, where global shortages occurred, and some of the strategies would have been common in terms of their approach across global regulatory agencies. All authorised medicines are included within the scope of the definition in terms of the Irish system, that's prescription and non-prescription medicines, and they're human medicines. There is a supply and demand perspective. So if there's no demand for a medicine to treat patients, a shortage of this product does not carry significance for patients. And the definition is applied at an individual product level. And this means that if a specific medicine could be defined as being in short supply, even if there are equivalent alternatives available. So our total number of shortages today at the time of this delivery of the webinar that's published on our website is a number of 340. This is all shortages. As of the beginning of the year, the HPRA publishes all notified shortages, and that was part of, I suppose, a plan that we have delivered in 2025, which was to move from just publishing medium and high impact shortages to all shortages. So 340 shortages could be 340 shortages where the product themselves could be something like atorvastatin, 10 milligrams, pack size of 28, marketed by Accord, just as an example. But there could be 6 or 7 other atorvastatin, 10 milligrams, pack size 28s, marketed by alternative MAHs. And that's an important feature of our shortages. When I suppose you hear in the media or there's metrics created to look to whether the problem is improving or disimproving, we can't look at notified shortages by itself or in isolation to really deliver any meaningful analysis, because it doesn't necessarily impact on problems related to continuity of supply and continuity of care, where you might be able to substitute at a product level with multiple generic suppliers. And discontinuations and withdrawals are not considered a shortage. What is not considered a medicinal shortage is where medicine is not authorised, or which is authorised and not marketed in Ireland for commercial reasons. If there's a delay in the supply of a medicine to a pharmacy due to logistical reasons or an error in delivery, where normal supply to a pharmacy from a wholesale distributor has been delayed, but there is significant stock at a wholesale level, that normal supply to patients ultimately will not be impacted. Or if one mainline wholesaler is not in a situation to supply a particular medicine, but others can supply this medicine, fundamentally, if the supply is sufficient to meet the demand within the supply chain, we wouldn't necessarily consider it to be a medicinal shortage. It is only where the supply is insufficient to meet the demand that we would consider it to be a shortage. Why do medicine shortages occur? We have data generated since the medicine shortage framework, I suppose, was rolled out. In particular, the 2-year analysis that was published looked at all of the shortages notified within a 2-year period, and presented that analysis, I suppose, for public consumption. And from this, we can say 60% of shortages relate to delays or breakdowns during manufacturing or a product quality issue. Unexpected increase in demand can also cause or exacerbate certain shortages, and that can be due to a changing prescribing practices. And then you may have greater than anticipated level of seasonal illness, resulting in shortages of medicines and needed to treat those illnesses. And certainly after COVID-19 and some of the patterns in terms of consumptions, in terms of dips and then peaks, certainly led to an impact in terms of forecasting and medicines availability. Just as we came out of COVID-19. That's national data, and this correlates to European data. And there's a link provided here on this slide if anybody is interested in looking at some of the preliminary outputs that are coming from a dedicated joint action, which is a 3-year project referred to as Chessman and Work Package 5. They were responsible for looking at root causes, and they've published a report of root causes across using data from all national competent authorities within the European Union. And you can see again that manufacturing issues are responsible for over half of shortages notified, followed by unexpected increase in demand, commercial reasons, and distribution. To a lesser extent, shortages were caused by quality and regulatory issues. So you can see that our national data, and we would have put national data into this survey, of course, but we're one of 27 member states. So you can see that there's commonality to the root causes of shortages across the European Union. In terms of the supply chain itself, when you take an active pharmaceutical ingredient right down to getting that pack onto the shelves of pharmacy and to the patients, there's several parts of the supply chain that can be subject to disruptions that ultimately result in a shortage of medicine, with manufacturing delays again being that most common cause, as well as logistical issues. And we've seen some of those in real terms that would relate to, say, storms and the ports at Holyhead or the Suez Canal, or issues even more recently with the airspace is being shut down over the course of, say, Israel and Iran's, I suppose, wars and conflicts. So it's a global supply chain, and the root causes are multifactorial, and it is a complex supply chain as well. And then you can also have exacerbating factors such as maybe some responses, such as uncoordinated purchasing, whether that's a pharmacy level or a patient level. And really that might constitute to be an overconsumption or putting medicines in presses that may ultimately expire, I suppose, in response to natural worries and concerns that the medicine might not be available. And again, we saw this phenomenon as probably every pharmacist saw that phenomenon during COVID-19, when patients would have come in and bought paracetamol and ibuprofen over the counter with I suppose as a concerned response rather than an actual clinical need, just to have, I suppose. And then the supply chain, just to elaborate out further in terms of the manufacturing complexity that goes into it. You don't just have the active pharmaceutical ingredient and API. There's also excipients, raw materials, packaging, and anything that goes wrong within that can ultimately end up in a disrupted supply and a pack not being available at the patient level. Quality testing, issues of nitrosamines. These are the sort of things that happen that fundamentally end up in a shortage of a medicine supply. And again, it's using those terms of complex and global, and down to the local level of the patient, the Irish patient being impacted. But some of it is very much outside of Ireland in terms of the manufacturing itself, and where problems can arise. um, then within the supply chain itself, just to break down some of the other regulatory issues and shipping delays, you can see some of the regulatory issues might be delay in the submission of a variation, no approved active pharmaceutical ingredient, or a delay in a CD license application. And then in terms of other quality issues, you have testing issues, sterility issues. Yeah, so I'm not going to over elaborate. It's kind of self-explanatory on the slide itself. So then how are medicine shortages handled by the medicine shortage framework? The HPRA oversees a multi-stakeholder framework intended to address the issue of human medicine shortages in Ireland. The aim of the framework is to help avoid potential shortages from occurring in the first place and reduce the impact on patients when shortages do occur. The multi-stakeholder framework is a very key term because the HPRA can coordinate this framework, but the entire, I suppose, potential to prevent and mitigate shortages is it has to take on other stakeholders to be effective, and other stakeholders need to be engaged for the framework to be fully effective, because the HPRA's remit doesn't extend to the likes of clinical advice, clinical guidance. And we also would have dependencies on information coming from manufacturers. And then we have, I suppose, a requirement for all actors, all identified actors within the supply chain to ensure that that pack that we refer to gets to the patient at the end of the supply chain. So that includes the likes of wholesale distributors. And so the responsibilities of the marketing authorization holders, they're obliged within the limits of the responsibilities to ensure appropriate and continued supplies to meet the needs of patients in the state. The oversight of the supply of their medicines nationally and globally allows for alignment of supply and demand, and they are also are responsible for assessing the impact of a shortage on patients, notifying the HPRA, and to prepare an appropriate response, taking into account that they do have those responsibilities to ensure appropriate and continued supplies. And that does extend to identifying appropriate mitigating measures. Other stakeholders we have listed here on the slides. We have the Health Service Executive. They would be responsible for policy and operational aspects, pricing agreements, clinical guidance. The Department of Health would have responsibilities related to overarching policy and direction, pricing agreements and legislation. Patient representatives would take the responsibilities of supporting patients and to provide information. And healthcare professionals would have responsibilities, again, in the mitigating measures for identifying alternatives and to act as good citizens, to act with the in response to, I suppose, the issued guidance around initiating patients or conserving supply where such advice is issued. Manufacturers are responsible for continued supply of medicines, the capacity to increase production, to support impact assessments as well. In terms of our coordination role of how we take the information in, there's a difference between a notification and a report. So all levels of the supply chain can notify or signal to the HPRA an issue that is that is a concern related to medicine shortages, but we only publish confirmed shortages via a notification from a marketing authorization holder. And that's important because it's only really the MAH that can confirm that they don't have enough supply gone into the supply chain that's in keeping with the purchase order. I suppose is a simple way to describe it. So if the wholesaler's purchase order for that particular supply line can't be met, that's where a shortage is going to commence from. The impact might be at a patient level, but the MAH doesn't necessarily have oversight of the supply chain down to patient level, but it does have oversight as to what it's putting into the supply chain. once we have that notification received, we will determine the impact against the published medicine shortage framework, and also propose to address the shortage if such proposals are there and within the remit of the HPRA. We would engage with other stakeholders as needed, and all of our information is publicly available for both healthcare professionals and members of the public. And that's just the information of our email address for which these forms can be submitted. When should medicine shortages be reported and notified? And this was a question that was submitted in advance, which was about the timeliness of notified shortages. So there isn't a limit that's set by the HPRA in the National Medicine Shortage Framework in terms of the expected duration of the shortage, nor is there a limit in the sense of out to when an MAH should notify. So, for example, it's not the case that they should wait and only 6 months out should submit a notification of a medium and high impact shortage. They should submit that as soon as it's known to them, and that includes a potential shortage. Because what we will do with a potential shortage is we will track it, and we will follow up. And the more time that we have with that potential shortage, the more time that we'll be able to take other actions and communication actions with alternative suppliers of a medicine. And within this presentation, you will see some of the limitations of the framework that directly correlate to the time of the notification from the MAH. There is a requirement to submit a notification form with the relevant details contained within that, as well as proposal for the handling of a shortage. And then there's the information that may be required from other stakeholders is also detailed within the medicine shortage framework. In terms of numbers of what we receive, and these are notifications in potential and actual, and it's just for the year of 2025 to date. So the slide itself doesn't read very well, and that's just the way that our Power BI report has produced this graph. It's January 2025 to September 2025. On average, we receive 113 notifications a month for analysis, processing, publication. We publish shortages 2 weeks from the expected date of impact as standard as part of the medicine shortage framework. So early notification of a potential or actual medicine shortage is critical in helping to prevent or mitigate a shortage. And I'll give you 2 good case examples that occurred in 2024 to really show the power of the framework. And then you will see within the data itself, I suppose, some of the limitations of the framework and why it's not necessarily always able to produce maybe the most desirable outcome, which is really to have no break in terms of continuity of supply or continuity of care for a patient. The assessment of and response to medicine shortages may involve the coordination of advice and activity by a range of stakeholders. And again, I have 2 case studies to really demonstrate that. And impacts assessment, shortage notifications and updates should be reliable, timely, consistent, and comprehensive. And again, within the slide set, I'm going to present what we are considering or what we're actively doing to try and improve the information that we receive, so that the information that we can publish is that it is reliable, timely, consistent, and comprehensive. But the dependency is that it's from the MAH, both to notify as well as notify when shortages has resolved. And more recently, we have put that caveat in every single communication that we issue so that stakeholders understand the dependency for timely information does come from manufacturers and MAHs. The impact assessment itself combines 2 main considerations: the availability of therapeutic alternatives and the potential impact on patients. And just to kind of describe that in more detail, and again, this is all published within our framework, so it's something that you can take out and look at your own discretion. But we look at cataloguing I suppose, notified shortages into whether there is an exact, similar, appropriate, comparable, or no alternative. And that looks at marketed medicines at a point in time. The assessments can be updated depending on whether there's further knock-on impacts in terms of, say, within a pharmaceutical class, or within, I suppose, where there might be exact alternatives. So the assessments are intended to be flexible in that regard, and in terms of the update, those updates should be reflected on our website. Um, but what is, I suppose, a frequent query that's received by the HPRA from pharmacists, healthcare professionals, members of the public is the publication of this information. Um, we will frequently get queries of what is the comparable alternative. It's not intended to direct clinical guidance, nor can the HPRA provide, I suppose, a type of medicine that might be suitable for an individual patient. So you can understand that this is quite a high level of assessment, and not intended to direct clinical practice. What it will dictate, or what it might influence, is further actions that might be taken as part of the overall assessment and communication and coordination functions. And then in terms of the impact on patients, again, put into three categories of mild, moderate, severe. And again, this is not intended to dictate clinical practice, or to influence clinical guidance in any way. It is, again, something that we would use internally, and it might be applied to where we're looking at trying to, say, expedite a variation, or we're trying to expedite controlled drugs import license or export license. These are all the sort of I suppose, measures that we can use, or tools, or I suppose a systematic way of assessing in order to make sure that we can prioritize those, I suppose, regulatory, where we have that regulatory remit, to make sure that we take those actions, and put maybe something like a variation to the top of the pile, when our licensing colleagues in HPAR and within the HPRA might have 100 variations to process. And what they will do is ask the shortages team for advice in order to be able to triage and prioritize some types of applications where there is a request for an expedited assessment. They will, I suppose, confirm that with the shortages team. And again, this is just information that's directly pulled from the framework itself. It's how we use the impact on the patient and the therapeutic alternative to catalogue that into low, medium, and high. And as promised, like I said, I would show you the limitations of the framework. This is 2025 data as well, and you can see everybody went on their summer holidays. So we got a notification 10 days after a shortage had actually occurred, on average within July 2025. But you can see across all calendar months, taken into account seasonal variations with staffing and availability, that we get about 11 days notice from when a shortage notification is submitted to when the shortage is expected to impact on average. And that's a particular limitation of the framework, because 11 days is not quite enough time for the HPRA to ask alternative suppliers of generic medicines to increase their production and to meet an increase in demand. Because I suppose an MAH with 50% of the market share is expected to go out of stock for 6 months. Medicines for Europe gave a nice presentation to another joint action that I thought was quite useful from understanding the complexity of the supply chain. And I can provide the link to it afterwards. I didn't put it into the slides, but some of the forecasting and planning and orders that's done on a manufacturing level, if we recall that slide of all the various different parts and components that go into manufacturing a finished product, you might order your packaging materials 12 months out of, and there isn't that degree of flexibility within the supply chain to increase that order to make those packaging materials readily available to package more finished product to meet that increase in demand. So really, the more time that we have, the more capacity that there is within the system itself to respond. And that is a current limitation. In terms of the 2-year review data, again, it is a bit out of date, and we do have a plan to bring forward more contemporaneous data on shortages that's available publicly, starting from this year to produce last year's data. But it's still relevant because we're still seeing these trends when we do have taken, I suppose, data cuts and looked at it. So most of our notifications come from the marketing authorization holders, notifications being what we require to publish a shortage. Other than that, we would refer to this total pie chart as being signals, and signals may turn into a notification submitted by an MAH, and we get smaller levels of activity in terms of signals from the market in terms of engagement with those reports from healthcare professionals, wholesalers, and patients. I would say that we don't mandate a report to be submitted in any way, shape, or form. We take emails to shortages at HPRA, and we would take that as a signal coming from outside of an MAH, and that would be how a shortage case gets opened. So it's not a case that you have to fill in a form, but we do have, I suppose, a structured form to get structured data in that can also be submitted. And what we see then over the course of when the framework was rolled out first in 2019 to the beginning of 2023 is increasing engagement from healthcare professionals in submitting that type of intelligence to the HPRA. And then in terms of the main therapeutic areas, again, this is from the 2-year review, but we're seeing commonality or same trends as more recent data is analysed. These are the main therapeutic areas that for which the shortage notification was related to. And then in terms of more recent data, in terms of top tens, or what do we see most cases being opened for? Cases, again, being signals of shortages, and this metric is the case itself. It's not necessarily that confirmed notified shortage with a start date and end date, but there will be quite a degree of correlation between a signal and an actual shortage. So you can see here, and that's probably speaking to a lot of people who are on the call, the top 10 INN notified shortages between January 2024 and the 4th of September 2025. We have a website searchable list. As I said, there was 300 notified when the slides were being finalised for today's presentation. And we have new functionality since the beginning of 2025, which is a pertinent update since this presentation was given at an IOP webinar last year by my colleague Jennifer. And I think this is an interesting functionality for pharmacists that they may or may not want to engage with. That may not be, I suppose, common knowledge. So we have our medicine shortage list, and there's no major change to that. You can filter that for the notified shortages in the last week that occurred, and you can vary whether you want to do it by notification date or alphabetically. There's a variety of ways that you can present that information, but also now we have this bell function that you can see here in our authorized medicines list. And a bell function is where we can, our system now talks across shortages and authorized medicines, and that bell is showing that Abidec has a current notified shortage. And Abidec kind of sits as a one authorized product, but if you had, say, a list of interchangeable medicines like atorvastatin that I referenced at the beginning, you can see across all the atorvastatins how many have a bell attached to it. So it's another way of looking maybe at a group of medicines and a kind of a quick reference to where there's a confirmed unavailability, and it might be maybe a more intuitive way of searching if you're looking for maybe alternatives where you can see the bells themselves. So you can also search by, say, ATC, and you will also be able to see anything with a bell that has a notified shortage, so you don't have to go between 2 pages of the HPRA website. And then we have weekly alerts. So you sign up for those on our main webpage. As soon as you go onto the landing page, you'll see in the top right corner my alerts, where you can register, and you will get a weekly update of the notified shortages in the last week that have occurred. These are also published on our website, and these are also you can filter, so you can get the same information if you go to our website. But if you do want to be in receipt of, I suppose, regular updates of new notified shortages, there is the mechanism via my alerts to do that. And then mitigation measures. Again, these were specific questions that were submitted about what can we do for a shortage. So there are regulatory responses, and we prevent. You see shortages, and you see the 340 shortages that are notified and current and published on our website. But what you don't necessarily see is the activity that would happen that prevent shortages. And one of those activities would be the likes of a batch specific request. Another activity, we talked about shortages being at a product level. So that example of the atorvastatin, but you might be with good information in a timely fashion be able to prevent knock-on shortages by engaging with other MAHs of alternative medicines, and asking them, notifying them of the interruption, the changing in market dynamics. And they are able, and there is examples that we can present to uplift or increase their manufacturing capacity. I know I talked about the challenges of that, but they are able to do it as well. There is challenges to it, and there's challenges to do it in terms of big scale, but there is also a capacity to increase, within the production chain, or to redistribute or to reallocate across multiple markets where these medicines are being distributed and supplied, to meet gaps, and that's another prevention measure that does happen as well. There's other prevention measures like the expedited variation for a product and that being processed. There's measures within the quality defects and recall team in terms of assessing a quality defect, taking into account what the impact would be in terms of the non-availability, and that informing the risk assessment, and that product ultimately being distributed, sometimes with a caution in use notification, in order for that supply not to be interrupted. Again, that's a preventative measure, and it's within the regulatory remit of the HPRA, and these activities happen on a daily basis. There's engagement with other agencies, there's expedited inspections and variations for manufacturers and wholesalers. There's looking at equitable distribution practice or supply quotas or quota allocation. There's reimbursement codes or hardship arrangements, and then there's clinical guidance that can be issued as mitigation measures. And then we have communication responses as well. Some of those are national communications responses, usually involving this medicines criticality assessment group that I'm going to detail on subsequent slides. But sometimes they can come via the EMA, MSSG, this executive steering group for medicine shortages and safety, that I referenced, that we have involvement with. They are currently responsible for a pilot program of medicine shortage communications. And we've had a number of those communications issue in more recent times, one of which would have been a liraglutide discontinuation. An MSC was disseminated in the last calendar month for that, to notify all stakeholders of this upcoming discontinuation of liraglutide for the diabetes indication, before I cause any panic, not the Saxenda, if I get the brand name right, for the obesity indication. So these are also looked at, so that the market can respond in a timely fashion, that patients can be managed by their clinician, patients can switch treatments, etc., etc. So in terms of the two examples from 2024, because I thought this was presented at last year's IOP, so I apologize if anybody attended this webinar and is attending again today. But on discussion with Jennifer, who delivered it last year, I still think it's a really good example of how the framework can be very effective. It is from last year, but there was some further developments that have happened between the last webinar and today. And so they are updated slides. but it's really just to show the power of timely communications. Um, and Pabernex is a good example of that. So in terms of we got the shortage notification from the MAH, where it was expected to impact from September 2024 until Q3 2025. And the Medicines Criticality Assessment Group was convened to consider the shortage. And at the time, it would have been assessed with all the preceding slides in terms of it would have anticipated to have a high impact and probably dictated, I suppose, the level of communication that would have been issued out to that multi-stakeholder framework. I suppose about needing to have appropriate mitigation measures in place when this shortage was expected to impact. This is what the Medicines Criticality Assessment Group consists of. If people on the call don't carry awareness of this already, I suppose we are one participating party to this group. The DOH chairs it alongside the HSE. The other representatives that will come from the HSE will be from the National Cancer Control Programme, from the Access and Integration Drug Management Programme, from the Pharmaceutical Society of Ireland. Clinical expertise will be called on an ad hoc basis, and then the Corporate Pharmaceutical Unit in PCRS. And I suppose outside of that, there will be, I suppose, information fed in from companies, trade associations, and primary wholesalers, I suppose, to inform the discussions at MCAG. So the output from the MCAG was there was a HSE-led stakeholder engagement within clinical groups, and the HSE published clinical recommendations that was led by the AIDMP, formerly the Acute Hospital Drug Management Programme. The MAH put allocations in place in partnership with their wholesaler at wholesale level based on average historical demand. Due to rationalisation and a conservation strategy, the shortage extended to an actual date of impact of the 1st of May 2025 instead of the anticipated date of September 2024. So it's really just showing you the power of clinical guidance, rationalisation, optimisation, no waste, highlighting critical patient groups, using the medicine in a way that's those I suppose extensive controls to ensure that the product that was remaining in the supply chain was optimized to the very best extent that it could be. And in that intervening time period when we received the notification from the MAH, at that time, there would have been no alternative vitamin B and C concentrate for a solution for infusion that was marketed in Ireland. Pabernex itself, it was a European-wide shortage, and there was a similarity in terms of lack of alternatives across multiple member states. And what we got out in terms of the intervening period is actually a licensing of a whole other alternative medicine. It was licensed at the end of 2024, and the MAH has notified us that that is now marketed and available. But we will continue to engage with the licensing team to indicate, I suppose, the level of a high impact shortage in order to expedite the ongoing variation. To ensure that Pabernex can come back as soon as possible, can be resupplied as soon as possible, recognising its role in clinical guidance, in terms of clinical experience, and also to have an alternative that it's in terms of looking at resilience, continuity of supply, not having a sole supplier status, and having multiple authorised medicines marketed, I suppose, is a goal within the shortages team itself, as well as within the wider organisation of the HPRA to look at that under, I suppose, an active examination to be proactive in bringing forward authorizations for medicines that are needed to ensure, I suppose, public health and population health for Irish patients, and that they're authorised medicines. And again, I think that was a specific question that was submitted, and it is, I suppose, an area of an active work stream within the HPRA. The second example has a lot of commonality to it, but we didn't get timely information for this particular one. And it just really goes to highlight, or the purposes of presenting it in today's webinar is really to highlight, I suppose, the coordination aspect. And I suppose there was a degree of success, even though the notified shortage was and the actions that were taken, it did mean that there was a break in treatment for individual patients, and there was, I suppose, um, that impact at a patient level, which was well understood by the shortages team. But in terms of the steps that were taken to ensure that once patients could get resupplied, that they could continue to get resupplied. So this again might have been an experience, a direct experience of a registered pharmacist working in the community, where they may have been dispensing this under the high tech arrangements to a patient and not had it available to them towards the end of last year. It had, at the time of the shortage occurring, a license indication that was limited to hepatitis B and C. Um, but it was used at that time off label for myeloproliferative neoplasms, in particular PV and ET. And there was probably a particular cohort of patients that was very critical for being pregnant women, and also through clinician elicited expertise, we understood it to be one of the few disease modulating drugs that were available for MPN. So quite a critical product to have available. So we were notified of the shortage that was expected to begin in August 2024 and to resolve in June 2025. It was related to an increased overall demand for Pegasus, coupled with a manufacturing transfer leading to an intermittent shortage. In essence, the company, it was a divested product. They had API that was expected to last for 10 years in terms of creating the fill and finish final product. But because there was that overall demand, that API ran out quicker and the new manufacturing process wasn't set up in time. And that's what the intermittent shortage occurred for. Again, the medicines criticality group was convened. And in terms of what was presented back in September of 2024 was direct engagements with the MAH by the HPRA. We got small quantities of one strength, established that a batch-specific request was not possible due to the global nature, and established, I suppose, good information on expected resolution with dependencies at that time, but it did materialize as predicted. We had a face-to-face opportunity for engagement with the MAH. They were invited to a meeting of the European Medicines Agency Single Point of Contact Working Party. I am that single point of contact working party representative. So the MAH came to the meeting, and I suppose at that time they presented their European allocation plan, and Ireland wasn't being facilitated in terms of supply at that point in time because of the methodology that was used, which was based on historical demand. And I suppose it was through the collaboration and coordination that was facilitated by the EMA that the company was asked by Ireland and the HPRA, as well as the EMA, to reconsider its allocation plan to be fair and equitable across all European member states. And as a result of that, we had an allocation of 2,454 pre-filled syringes of all strengths provided by the MAH in November 2024. So that was a pivoting of their decision. We met with the primary wholesaler that was nominated by the MAH with the permission of the MAH to devise an allocation plan for the stock that was delivered. That wouldn't be typical, but the MAH didn't have a local affiliate, and we would have made clear that we had their permission to engage with the primary wholesaler as well as secondary wholesalers, so to include Uniphar, with an allocation plan, and we would have worked with the HSE CPU on that to make sure that we stayed within our remit and that there was broad agreement that we could devise a plan that was workable for the wholesalers and would ensure that the stock remained in Ireland for Irish patients, because at that time there was, I suppose, a risk of exporting out, given that it was a global shortage. There was a DHPC, which is a direct healthcare professional communication. These are now MSCs, medicine shortage communication. but at that time the pilot wasn't set up, and they were going under existing structures. That was disseminated by the EMA, and the National Cancer Control Programme issued internal clinical guidance to hospitals that we didn't publish on our website, but the NCCP did engage with us on that. And then we undertook stock monitoring to report back into the health service with the wholesalers, because at the time we expected the stock allocation to run out based on the existing demand that we could see up until the shortage notified. So we did have concerns, and we did active stock monitoring, but actually similar to the Pabernex case, we saw through the clinical guidance, optimization, rationalization, clinical, the patients of the highest priority, buy-in by the clinicians. We ended up having that stock allocation last until the shortages were resolved in June 2025 as predicted. And so these are good examples of how the framework can be effective in terms of that coordination role. Batch-specific requests is kind of technical, and it does a specific slide dedicated to that, just in case I lost anybody on that. They're accepted for critical medicines which hold marketing authorization by the HPRA, the European Commission, to bring a batch of product into compliance with its marketing authorization. We can facilitate the HPRA, not the shortages team, the licensing team. They can facilitate a BSR to ensure maintenance of supply of authorized medicines. There tend to be a limited duration, and we have guidance on our website on that. Most of our shortages they occur, they're notified, and the supply resumes. But we do, as I said, prevent about 20%, and this is from the 2-year review, but Risa's analysis is in keeping with this finding that we're preventing about 20% of shortages from occurring in the first place. We don't have a role that extends to pricing and reimbursement, pricing framework agreements, commercial issues, sourcing medicines, purchasing medicines, in particular, sourcing or purchasing exempt medicinal products. We don't have any role in that regard. Any clinical guidance would fall directly outside our remit. We can't compel a company to produce a medicine or to increase production, but we do work closely with companies to try and give them information that's not commercially sensitive, that would give them a sufficient confidence to do that of their own accord. And we can't compel a company to apply for a marketing authorization. I've referenced this a number of times across the presentation. It came with a series of recommendations, and we have sought to implement some of those recommendations since, I suppose, Jenny and I came into the HPRA at the beginning of 2024. One of those will be to increase transparency, and that will be the publication of all shortages. And then I promised within the presentation title that we'd look at some of the developments on the horizon. So specific to our team, our key deliverables for the end of this year in 2026 is the publication of an annual shortages report. So the purpose would be to make readily available national data on notified shortages, for industry engagement on improving notification timelines. We're developing training webinars and surveys, and intend to hold stakeholder events as well on this particular matter. I've referenced this joint action referred to as Chessman. We are a work package lead, so we will be delivering a sustainability report as work package 4 lead. And there will be a Chessman day as the joint action is supposed to end towards the end of this year, January 2026, that we will be facilitating and inviting relevant stakeholders to attend. And that's a kind of a watch and wait, because it'll be in November is when we expect to have a Chessman day, where we'll be presenting some information specific to the joint action, as well as some of the outputs from the work packages 5, 6, 7, and 8, which were the technical work packages, in terms of best practices and recommendations for improving shortages, harmonization, reporting, monitoring, mitigating, and prevention. And so we will be incorporating some of those findings once the joint action concludes. We are looking to generate specific reports on therapeutic area of concerns. So an example of this would be Nebules, we see, I suppose, a dependency there in terms of small numbers of suppliers in the market and chronic shortages. So we want to look to generate specific reports of this nature that's looking at a targeted area where we have, I suppose, ongoing issues with supply and availability. Introducing a system developments for stock monitoring, active stock monitoring at supply levels, um, including wholesalers. And we consider this to be facilitated by primary legislation introduced via the Health Miscellaneous Provision Bills. And then we want to continue to contribute to key working groups within European structures. So there's a working group for vulnerability analysis, that's looking at, I suppose, a methodology for assessing a vulnerable supply chain that's relevant for the legislative, I suppose, developments that are going to be outlined in subsequent slides. And then also Ireland led the subgroup discussions for the definition of a shortage, which was introduced on the first slide, but actually there's some more complexity to that than certainly I didn't appreciate before I came into the HPRA, because of the variance across European member states, and there's no, I suppose, granular definition of shortage beyond supply not meeting demand, which was really first introduced with the EMA expanded mandate legislation. So the definition of a shortage looks at notification by an MAH within a defined time frame and how a shortage resolution would be determined, and whether additional definitions or assessments such as limited impact or critical shortage should be considered. And that work I would expect to be published in time, more likely around some of the legislative changes coming to pass. And then more broadly, in terms of where we don't have, we're working within these structures, but we're not necessarily, we're waiting, I suppose, for the legislative changes that are occurring that would impact on medicine shortages and how medicine shortages are managed at a national level. These next series of slides are mostly taken from European institutions, so that I appropriately credit them. But it is this. I would hope across everything that I've verbally delivered, that nobody goes away from this webinar thinking that shortages are unique to Ireland, or that I suppose some of the aspects of our market itself is somehow make shortages more acute here. That's not the case. The evidence shows that that's not the case. It's a concern across all European shortages, or all European countries. So there is proposed solutions that are being sought by these European institutions that include the European Commission to improve coordination, monitoring and management of shortages, looking at earlier and harmonised notification of shortages and withdrawals, including shortage prevention plans as part of supply measures that are being introduced as part of the European new pharmaceutical legislation. And the Union list of critical medicines has already been published, or a version of this has already been published, and is subject to ongoing review, and subsequent versions are expected to be made available. But there's specific measures targeted around a Union list of critical list of medicines, and it will be underpinned by legislation in due course. And then a stronger coordinating role for the European medicines agencies, and more powers for member states and the Commission. So this is a kind of a timeline for how we've arrived at where we've arrived at today. I suppose the developments are ongoing. So the biggest, I suppose, things that aren't referenced there are the Critical Medicines Alliance, and the work that they did, as well as the Medicine Shortages Steering Group recommendations to strengthen supply chains. They were 2024 activities, and they're sort of translating into the publication of the proposal for the Critical Medicines Act. And prior to that, we had structured dialogue with industry and analysis around supply chain vulnerabilities that fed into the proposal on the pharma legislation and the EU critical medicines list. So in terms of that expanded mandate that's already passed, and that was really out of the COVID-19 experience, it was giving new powers to the European Medicines Agency for crisis situations, um, as well as, I suppose, powers to look at preparedness activities as well. And I suppose that's a regulation, and what that has introduced is obligations on wholesale distributions and other persons that are authorised or entitled to supply medicinal products, including on critical medicines lists, with relevant information and data, including information and data on the levels of stock for those medicinal products at the request of that member state. And that really harks back to those developments that I spoke to that are national and being rolled out at the end of this year in 2026 about introducing systems to have stock monitoring so that we can engage in the event that there is a crisis declared, such as COVID-19, where we would be obliged to do stock level reporting to the EMA. And that's via the European Shortages Monitoring Platform. That's fully operational since the beginning of this year. And it carries a range of functions for the EMA as well as for MAHs who are reporting shortages of centrally authorised products, so those that are authorised for all European markets. And it's also there now, sort of ready for taking in information such as stock levels to improve, I suppose, the responsiveness at times of crisis in order to be able to ensure that there's sufficient stock across all European member states to respond appropriately to the crisis at hand. In terms of on this slide, you'll see that reference to the already created role of the EMA in crisis, in times of crisis. That led to the creation of the MSSG and SPOC, and to the requirement for the EMA to develop this ESMP, which has been met in terms of the requirement was to develop it by February, and that has been met. The EU pharma legislation reinforces supply obligations around early notification and shortage prevention plan, and it looks at a preventative approach that union listed critical medicines and MSSG recommendations coming from structured dialogue. And then the Critical Medicines Alliance produced recommendations from an industrial policy measures, and that's looking again at a preventative approach, which is mainly industrial policy, looking at investments in EU manufacturing capacity, supply chain diversification, resilience, and leveraging aggregated demand across multiple member states. So then the EU legislation, I'm not going to repeat that because it's mostly what I just said there in terms of the shortages and security of supply chapter, introducing new measures looking at enhancing supply chain resilience and preventing shortages. And then the Critical Medicines Act, again, I'm not going to repeat that, but it's, I suppose, going past where I suppose the regulatory remit stops and maybe some other factors that influence supply and availability, such as procurement, and I suppose making sure that these two pieces of legislation or that I know that a stated goal of the Commission is that they're complementary pieces of legislation. I suppose, and in particular, the Critical Medicines Act looks at investment in manufacturing and designating strategic projects in order to facilitate more manufacturing in the EU and to promote resilience in that way. And that leads me to questions, and I probably ran over because I, yeah, I did run over. I'm sorry. Didn't really pay attention to the time I needed to pay attention to stop coughing.
That was fantastic, Ellen. It's so complex, it's so nuanced. There's so many moving parts. And yeah, you really made the point about these are European issues, they're global problems. I work in a community pharmacy, and customers come in, and when you try to explain to them these are problems beyond the town I'm working in or the county or the country, you know, sometimes they're kind of very, but will the pharmacy down the road not have it? So you made that point very well. And it is a point we have to make to our customers and our patients again and again. But it's very reassuring to see there's so much going on in the background. And we're in safe hands, I suppose, in that regard. You covered most of getting the questions in advance was a good idea. So you've covered all of those, and there are no questions in the question box.
I would say there was one question about why is there such a difference between the date of resolution and the date when you can actually purchase stock? And I don't have the answer to that, but I would hope that some of the developments like stock monitoring would mean that at least we can be more responsive when we receive queries like that, where, you
Mhm.
know, I would hope that those type of developments would at least mean that we can get more intelligent answers to some of those I suppose signals that we receive from healthcare professionals.
Mhm.
And just to your point, Fiona, maybe the next time you can say 75% of shortages are European shortages, and we have that from IQVIA data,
Okay,
as in
that's a good figure.
the shortage that's happening here is also happening in
Mhm.
75% of cases across multiple European markets.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a good figure just to be able to say, just to reassure people because, I mean, I suppose I meet the patients all of the time and can understand that and you've made the point, all of these strategies are to mitigate the impact on the patient. And I suppose it is, patients can be frustrated, which is understandable. Okay. So thank you so much for that. There is one question. So, do we have transparency in the fairness of supply of short stock by our wholesalers between the large group pharmacies and the smaller independent pharmacy?
So not at the moment, but again, those are some of the developments that we're looking to make sure that we can have that transparency in the system, and I suppose for all actors to carry awareness of the transparency so that we could see, say, significant stock holding at um, uh, we have to, I don't want to overcommit because we have to scope the feasibility of the system, but some European systems go down to pharmacy level and are able to develop apps that show patients the stock that's in an individual pharmacy. So we have
Right.
to, I think, respect maybe where we might not have the degree of IT infrastructure or the capacity. And that's why I introduced even the stakeholders that we do engage with, that we're very cognizant that we are here to facilitate good information, good transparency. But if we were able to get down to pharmacy level, I think that's the sort of work that we could do to really ensure equitable distribution and to stop uncoordinated stockpiling that do exacerbate shortages. So
Mhm.
the simple answer is no, but it's the sort of information that we're seeking to establish to have the most effective and communicative systems, given that we have a coordinated role and we do work with all these stakeholders and we're entirely respectful of all those stakeholders as well in terms of what they can deliver, like in terms of their own pharmacies. I think, well, I am a pharmacist. I don't necessarily work in community, but I do understand that there's a lot that gets put onto community pharmacies and that there's limited vendors and a limited capacity to go around your pharmacy and count how many boxes you have on the shelf. So if you don't have a stock monitoring system, will you be able to deliver that, through an automated system? Because we certainly won't be asking anybody to count boxes on a shelf. They are developments that are in other European member states, and patients can get on an app and see what's in a community pharmacy and go down, like what you said, Fiona, go down to the next community pharmacy if the app shows them
Okay.
that they have a box. So these are the sort of things that we can look to try and improve the experience of shortages, I suppose.
Okay,
But
that's great.
fundamentally, the root cause is manufacturing, and we want to address manufacturing issues.
Yeah, yeah, and in some cases, also like you did highlight the timeliness of notifications. And if people knew earlier, perhaps it might be easier to mitigate. Okay, the next question now is very specific regarding diazepam shortages. And you
Yeah.
mentioned about the weekly updates, and the weekly updates are very useful. So I saw the weekly update recently, and I saw the two strengths of diazepam sitting in the update as being short. So are there any alternatives available in the short term? Any unlicensed versions? Would you be aware of that?
So that would be where our remit doesn't extend to, but like speaking to timely notifications, we received a diazepam notification as a signal from healthcare professionals that ended up in an investigation with the MAH who told us it was out of stock. That's not ideal. It's just not an ideal situation to allow for those mitigation measures to be brought in. So it is very specific and it's sort of very current. And what I would say is it's where we would see that concern and that need to communicate further, in particular in terms of what we've received to date. We don't necessarily have to have more than one or two, but coming from where they're coming from for us to say this is highly concerning. And so I had to prioritize my presentation, but tomorrow we would take the action of communicating with the addiction program to understand,
Mm,
that clinical guidance or to make sure that they're fully aware because we can't issue clinical guidance. I think that's clear. So, and we don't have that role in procurement or sourcing on licensed medicines. But that would be a viable mitigation measure. But even when it's so late and you're needing to supply that, and it's probably a high volume for certain particular areas or certain particular pharmacies, that you probably run into an out of stock at a pharmacy level quite quickly
mhm,
and you need your supply really quickly, that maybe the EMP, even just the lead times on that might not necessarily um, end up in that. What you might end up in is a situation of a patient being left without the continuity of care piece. So
mm,
that's the sort of action and that's the sort of shortage. It's very current. So I suppose that's the limit of what I can deliver here on a webinar.
mhm.
But if you want to email us and keep abreast of any of those type of developments, please do.
Okay.
Um, and I can see there's a shortage. Sorry, Fiona, I can see there's another one there just on Brexit and the
Brexit,
Windsor
yeah.
framework. Um, the Brexit and Windsor framework piece is probably where we see shortages going. There's shortages, and what we presented today is medicine shortages and how our team manages it. But there's another issue of unavailability and unavailability that's related to, say, non-marketed medicines. So they're not considered to be a shortage as such. And I suppose we see the Windsor framework and joint packs as maybe exacerbating some of the factors, the commercial factors that might lead to unavailabilities, non-marketing or more withdrawals. So we do
Okay.
have a Brexit group in the HPRA, and that's actually meeting tomorrow that examined all companies' the plans to continue to market with good returns in terms of an intention to continue to market medicines post the introduction of the Windsor framework. And what we're also discussed today, actually hot off the press, is what we will do when the Brexit group, because it's September now, so it's been 9 months since when the Windsor framework was introduced. But how will we continue to examine whether we're exposed to more unavailability issues from market withdrawals and discontinuations, where the shortages team may be able to facilitate the wider organisation, I suppose, lens going into that area. So nothing has come out yet to suggest that there's less medicines, but we do acknowledge that it could be an exacerbating factor for creating maybe some of the more commercial elements that might lead to unavailabilities.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Ellen. Okay, so there are no more questions and we're running over time. So thank you so much to Ellen. That was such an informative presentation. Grace has put the link to the post-webinar survey into the chat again. So please do complete the survey. Please start a CPG cycle. We're all familiar with the CPG cycle now at this stage. And finally, just to mention, that our next webinar will be on Wednesday, the 8th of October, which will be delivered by Lena Clark from the Irish Medicines Verification Organisation for an update on FMD. So thanks again to Ellen and thank you to everybody and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.